This means that virtue forfeits some part of its promised reward. The docile and continent ego does not enjoy the trust of its mentor and strives in vain, it would seem, to acquire it. The objection will at once be made that these difficulties are artificial ones, and it will be said that a stricter and more vigilant conscience is precisely the hallmark of a moral man. Moreover, when saints call themselves sinners, they are not so wrong, considering the temptations to instinctual satisfaction to which they are exposed in a specially high degree. Since, as is well known, temptations are merely increased by constant frustration, whereas an occasional satisfaction of them causes them to diminish, at least for the time being. The field of ethics, which is so full of problems, presents us with another fact, namely that ill luck, that is, external frustration, so greatly enhances the power of the conscience in the superego. As long as things go well with a man, his conscience is lenient and lets the ego do all sorts of things. But when misfortune befalls him, he searches his soul, acknowledges his sinfulness, heightens the demands of his conscience, imposes abstinences on himself, and punishes himself with penances. Whole peoples have behaved in this way, and still do. This, however, is easily explained by the original infantile stage of conscience, which, as we see, is not given up after the introjection into the superego, but persists alongside of it and behind it. Fate is regarded as a substitute for the parental agency. If a man is unfortunate, it means that he is no longer loved by this highest power. And, threatened by such a loss of love, he once more bows to the parental representative in his superego, a representative whom, in his days of good fortune, he was ready to neglect. This becomes especially clear where fate is looked upon in the strictly religious sense of being nothing else than an expression of the divine will. The people of Israel had believed themselves to be the favorite child of God, and when the Great Father caused misfortune after misfortune to rain down upon this people of his, they were never shaken in their belief in his relationship to them, or questioned his power or righteousness. Instead, they produced the prophets who held up their sinfulness before them. And out of their sense of guilt, they created the over-strict commandments of their priestly religion. It is remarkable how differently a primitive man behaves. If he has met with a misfortune, he does not throw the blame on himself, but on his fetish, which has obviously not done its duty, and he gives it a thrashing instead of punishing himself. Thus we know of two origins of the sense of guilt, one arising from fear of an authority, and the other, later on, arising from fear of the superego. The first insists upon a renunciation of instinctual satisfactions. The second, as well as doing this, presses for punishment, since the continuance of the forbidden wishes cannot be concealed from the superego. We have also learned how the severity of the superego, the demands of conscience, is to be understood. It is simply a continuation of the severity of the external authority, to which it has succeeded and which it has in part replaced. We now see in what relationship the renunciation of instinct stands to the sense of guilt. Originally, renunciation of instinct was the result of fear of an external authority. One renounced one's satisfactions in order not to lose its love. If one has carried out this renunciation, one is, as it were, quits with the authority, and no sense of guilt should remain. But with fear of the superego, the case is different. Here, instinctual renunciation is not enough, for the wish persists and cannot be concealed from the superego. Thus, in spite of the renunciation that has been made, a sense of guilt comes about. This constitutes a great economic disadvantage in the erection of a superego, or, as we may put it, in the formation of a conscience. Instinctual renunciation now no longer has a completely liberating effect. Virtuous continence is no longer rewarded with the assurance of love. A threatened external unhappiness, loss of love and punishment on the part of the external authority, has been exchanged for a permanent internal unhappiness. for the tension of the sense of guilt. These interrelations are so complicated, and at the same time so important, that, at the risk of repeating myself, I shall approach them from yet another angle. The chronological sequence, then, would be as follows. First comes renunciation of instinct, owing to fear of aggression by the external authority. This is, of course, what fear of the loss of love amounts to, for love is a protection against this punitive aggression. After that comes the erection of an internal authority, and renunciation of instinct owing to fear of it, owing to fear of conscience. In this second situation, bad intentions are equated with bad actions, and hence come a sense of guilt and a need for punishment. The aggressiveness of conscience keeps up the aggressiveness of the authority. So far, things have no doubt been made clear. But where does this leave room for the reinforcing influence of misfortune, of renunciation imposed from without, and for the extraordinary severity of conscience in the best and most tractable people? We have already explained both these peculiarities of conscience, but we probably still have an impression that those explanations do not go to the bottom of the matter, and leave a residue still unexplained. And here at last an idea comes in which belongs entirely to psychoanalysis, and which is foreign to people's ordinary way of thinking. This idea is of a sort which enables us to understand why the subject matter was bound to seem so confused and obscure to us. For it tells us that conscience, or more correctly, the anxiety which later becomes conscience, is indeed the cause of instinctual renunciation to begin with, but that later the relationship is reversed. Every renunciation of instinct now becomes a dynamic source of conscience, and every fresh renunciation increases the latter's severity and intolerance. If we could only bring it better into harmony with what we already know about the history of the origin of conscience, we should be tempted to defend the paradoxical statement that conscience is the result of instinctual renunciation, or that instinctual renunciation, imposed on us from without, creates conscience, which then demands further instinctual renunciation. The contradiction between this statement and what we have previously said about the genesis of conscience is in point of fact not so very great, and we see a way of further reducing it. In order to make our exposition easier, let us take as our example the aggressive instinct, and let us assume that the renunciation in question is always a renunciation of aggression. This, of course, is only to be taken as a temporary assumption. The effect of instinctual renunciation on the conscience, then, is that every piece of aggression whose satisfaction the subject gives up is taken over by the superego and increases the latter's aggressiveness against the ego. This does not harmonize well with the view that the original aggressiveness of conscience is a continuance of the severity of the external authority, and therefore has nothing to do with renunciation. But the discrepancy is removed if we postulate a different derivation for this first installment of the superego's aggressivity. A considerable amount of aggressiveness must be developed in the child against the authority which prevents him from having his first, but nonetheless his most important, satisfactions, whatever the kind of instinctual deprivation that is demanded of him may be. But he is obliged to renounce the satisfaction of this revengeful aggressiveness. He finds his way out of this economically difficult situation with the help of familiar mechanisms. By means of identification, he takes the unattackable authority into himself. The authority now turns into his superego and enters into possession of all the aggressiveness which a child would have liked to exercise against it. The child's ego has to content itself with the unhappy role of the authority, the father, who has been thus degraded. Here, as so often, the real situation is reversed. If I were the father and you were the child, I should treat you badly. The relationship between the superego and the ego is a return, distorted by a wish, of the real relationships between the ego, as yet undivided, and an external object. That is typical, too. But the essential difference is that the original severity of the superego does not, or does not so much, represent the severity which one has experienced from it, the object, or which one attributes to it. It represents rather one's own aggressiveness towards it. If this is correct, we may assert truly that in the beginning conscience arises through the suppression of an aggressive impulse, and that it is subsequently reinforced by fresh suppressions of the same kind. Which of these two views is correct? The earlier one, which genetically seemed so unassailable, or the newer one, which rounds off the theory in such a welcome fashion? Clearly, and by the evidence, too, of direct observations, both are justified. They do not contradict each other, and they even coincide at one point, for the child's revengeful aggressiveness will be in part determined by the amount of punitive aggression which he expects from his father. Experience shows, however, that the severity of the superego which a child develops in no way corresponds to the severity of treatment which he has himself met with. The severity of the former seems to be independent of that of the latter. A child who has been very leniently brought up can acquire a very strict conscience. But it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to convince oneself that severity of upbringing does also exert a strong influence on the formation of the child's superego. What it amounts to is that in the formation of the superego and the emergence of a conscience, innate constitutional factors and influences from the real environment act in combination. This is not at all surprising. On the contrary, it is a universal etiological condition for all such processes. It can also be asserted that when a child reacts to his first great instinctual frustrations with excessively strong aggressiveness and with a correspondingly severe superego, he is following a phylogenetic model and is going beyond the response that would be currently justified. For the father of prehistoric times was undoubtedly terrible, and an extreme amount of aggressiveness may be attributed to him. Thus, if one shifts over from individual to phylogenetic development, the differences between the two theories of the genesis of conscience are still further diminished. On the other hand, a new and important difference makes its appearance between these two developmental processes. We cannot get away from the assumption that man's sense of guilt springs from the Oedipus complex and was acquired at the killing of the father by the brothers banded together. On that occasion, an act of aggression was not suppressed, but carried out. But it was the same act of aggression whose suppression in the child is supposed to be the source of his sense of guilt. At this point, I should not be surprised if the reader were to exclaim angrily, "So it makes no difference whether one kills one's father or not. One gets a feeling of guilt in either case." We may take leave to raise a few doubts here. Either it is not true that the sense of guilt comes from suppressed aggressiveness, or else the whole story of the killing of the father is a fiction, and the children of primeval man did not kill their fathers any more often than children do nowadays. Besides, if it is not fiction but a plausible piece of history, it would be a case of something happening which everyone expects to happen, namely, of a person feeling guilty because he really has done something which cannot be justified. And of this event, which is after all an everyday occurrence, psychoanalysis has not yet given any explanation. That is true, and we must make good the omission. Nor is there any great secret about the matter. When one has a sense of guilt after having committed a misdeed, and because of it, the feeling should more properly be called remorse. It relates only to a deed that has been done, and, of course, it presupposes that a conscience, the readiness to feel guilty, was already in existence before the deed took place. Remorse of this sort can, therefore, never help us to discover the origin of conscience and of the sense of guilt in general. What happens in these everyday cases is usually this. An instinctual need acquires the strength to achieve satisfaction in spite of the conscience, which is, after all, limited in its strength. And with the natural weakening of the need owing to its having been satisfied, the former balance of power is restored. Psychoanalysis is thus justified in excluding from the present discussion the case of a sense of guilt due to remorse, however frequently such cases occur, and however great their practical importance. But if the human sense of guilt goes back to the killing of the primal father, that was, after all, a case of remorse. Are we to assume that at that time a conscience and a sense of guilt were not, as we have presupposed, in existence before the deed? If not, where in this case did the remorse come from? There is no doubt that this case should explain the secret of the sense of guilt to us and put an end to our difficulties. And I believe it does. This remorse was the result of the primordial ambivalence of feeling towards the father. His sons hated him, but they loved him too. After their hatred had been satisfied by their act of aggression, their love came to the fore in their remorse for the deed. It set up the superego by identification with the father. It gave that agency the father's power, as though as a punishment for the deed of aggression they had carried out against him, and it created the restrictions which were intended to prevent a repetition of the deed. And since the inclination to aggressiveness against the father was repeated in the following generations, the sense of guilt too persisted, and it was reinforced once more by every piece of aggressiveness that was suppressed and carried over to the superego. Now, I think, we can at last grasp two things perfectly clearly: the part played by love in the origin of conscience, and the fatal inevitability of the sense of guilt. Whether one has killed one's father or has abstained from doing so is not really the decisive thing. One is bound to feel guilty in either case, for the sense of guilt is an expression of the conflict due to ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between eros and the instinct of destruction or death. This conflict is set going as soon as men are faced with the task of living together. So long as the community assumes no other form than that of the family, the conflict is bound to express itself in the Oedipus complex, to establish the conscience, and to create the first sense of guilt. When an attempt is made to widen the community, the same conflict is continued in forms which are dependent on the past, and it is strengthened and results in a further intensification of the sense of guilt. Since civilization obeys an internal erotic impulsion which causes human beings to unite in a closely knit group, it can only achieve the same through an ever-increasing reinforcement of the sense of guilt. What began in relation to the father is completed in relation to the group. If civilization is a necessary course of development from the family to humanity as a whole, then, as a result of the inborn conflict arising from ambivalence, of the eternal struggle between the trends of love and death, there is inextricably bound up with it an increase of the sense of guilt, which will perhaps reach heights that the individual finds hard to tolerate. One is reminded of the great poet's moving arraignment of the heavenly powers. To earth, this weary earth, you bring us, to guilt you let us heedless go, then leave repentance fierce to wring us, a moment's guilt, an age of woe. And we may well heave a sigh of relief at the thought that it is nevertheless vouchsafed to a few to salvage without effort from the whirlpool of their own feelings the deepest truths, towards which the rest of us have to find our way through tormenting uncertainty and with restless groping. Chapter 8. The last chapter. Having reached the end of his journey, the author must ask his readers' forgiveness for not having been a more skillful guide, and for not having spared them empty stretches of road and troublesome detours. There is no doubt that it could have been done better. I will attempt, late in the day, to make some amends. In the first place, I suspect that the reader has the impression that our discussions on the sense of guilt disrupt the framework of this essay, that they take up too much space, so that the rest of its subject matter, with which they are not always closely connected, is pushed to one side. This may have spoilt the structure of my paper, but it corresponds faithfully to my intention to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and to show that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Thus, conscience does make cowards of us all. That the education of young people at the present day conceals from them the part which sexuality will play in their lives is not the only reproach which we are obliged to make against it. Its other sin is that it does not prepare them for the aggressiveness of which they are destined to become the objects. In sending the young out into life with such a false psychological orientation, education is behaving as though one were to equip people starting on a polar expedition with summer clothing and maps of the Italian lakes. In this it becomes evident that a certain misuse is being made of ethical demands. The strictness of those demands would not do so much harm if education were to say, "This is how men ought to be in order to be happy and to make others happy. But you have to reckon on their not being like that." Instead of this, the young are made to believe that everyone else fulfills those ethical demands, that is, that everyone else is virtuous. It is on this that the demand is based, that the young too shall become virtuous. To repeat, my intention is to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and to show that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Anything that still sounds strange about this statement, which is the final conclusion of our investigation, can probably be traced to the quite peculiar relationship, as yet completely unexplained, which the sense of guilt has to our consciousness. In the common case of remorse, which we regard as normal, this feeling makes itself clearly enough perceptible to consciousness. Indeed, we are accustomed to speak of a consciousness of guilt instead of a sense of guilt. Our study of the neuroses, to which, after all, we owe the most valuable pointers to an understanding of normal conditions, brings us up against some contradictions. In one of those affections, obsessional neurosis, the sense of guilt makes itself noisily heard in consciousness. It dominates the clinical picture and the patient's life as well, and it hardly allows anything else to appear alongside of it. But in most other cases and forms of neurosis, it remains completely unconscious, without, on that account, producing any less important effects. Our patients do not believe us when we attribute an unconscious sense of guilt to them. In order to make ourselves at all intelligible to them, we tell them of an unconscious need for punishment, in which the sense of guilt finds expression. But its connection with a particular form of neurosis must not be overestimated. Even in obsessional neurosis, there are types of patients who are not aware of their sense of guilt, or who only feel it as a tormenting uneasiness, a kind of anxiety, if they are prevented from carrying out certain actions. It ought to be possible eventually to understand these things, but as yet we cannot. Here, perhaps, we may be glad to have it pointed out that the sense of guilt is at bottom nothing else but a topographical variety of anxiety. In its later phases, it coincides completely with fear of the superego. And the relations of anxiety to consciousness exhibit the same extraordinary variations. Anxiety is always present somewhere or other behind every symptom, but at one time it takes noisy possession of the whole of consciousness, while at another it conceals itself so completely that we are obliged to speak of unconscious anxiety, or, if we want to have a clearer psychological conscience, since anxiety is in the first instance simply a feeling, of possibilities of anxiety. Consequently, it is very conceivable that the sense of guilt produced by civilization is not perceived as such either, and remains to a large extent unconscious, or appears as a sort of malaise, a dissatisfaction, for which people seek other motivations. Religions, at any rate, have never overlooked the part played in civilization by a sense of guilt. Furthermore, a point which I failed to appreciate elsewhere, they claim to redeem mankind from this sense of guilt, which they call sin. From the manner in which, in Christianity, this redemption is achieved, by the sacrificial death of a single person, who in this manner takes upon himself a guilt that is common to every one, we have been able to infer what the first occasion may have been on which this primal guilt, which was also the beginning of civilization, was acquired. Though it cannot be of great importance, it may not be superfluous to elucidate the meaning of a few words, such as superego, conscience, sense of guilt, need for punishment, and remorse, which we have often perhaps used too loosely and interchangeably. They all relate to the same state of affairs, but denote different aspects of it. The superego is an agency which has been inferred by us, and conscience is a function which we ascribe, among other functions, to that agency. This function consists in keeping a watch over the actions and intentions of the ego and judging them, in exercising a censorship. The sense of guilt, the harshness of the superego, is thus the same thing as the severity of the conscience. It is the perception which the ego has of being watched over in this way, the assessment of the tension between its own strivings and the demands of the superego. The fear of this critical agency, a fear which is at the bottom of the whole relationship, the need for punishment, is an instinctual manifestation on the part of the ego, which has become masochistic under the influence of a sadistic superego. It is a portion, that is to say, of the instinct towards internal destruction present in the ego, employed for forming an erotic attachment to the superego. We ought not to speak of a conscience until a superego is demonstrably present. As to a sense of guilt, we must admit that it is in existence before the superego, and therefore before conscience too. At that time it is the immediate expression of fear of the external authority, a recognition of the tension between the ego and that authority. It is the direct derivative of the conflict between the need for the authority's love and the urge towards instinctual satisfaction, whose inhibition produces the inclination to aggression. The superimposition of these two strata of the sense of guilt, one coming from fear of the external authority, the other from fear of the internal authority, has hampered our insight into the position of conscience in a number of ways. Remorse is a general term for the ego's reaction in a case of sense of guilt. It contains, in little altered form, the sensory material of the anxiety which is operating behind the sense of guilt. It is itself a punishment, and can include the need for punishment. Thus, remorse, too, can be older than conscience. Nor will it do any harm if we once more review the contradictions which have for a while perplexed us during our inquiry. Thus, at one point, the sense of guilt was the consequence of acts of aggression that had been abstained from. But at another point, and precisely at its historical beginning, the killing of the father, it was the consequence of an act of aggression that had been carried out. But a way out of this difficulty was found. For the institution of the internal authority, the superego altered the situation radically. Before this, the sense of guilt coincided with remorse. We may remark, incidentally, that the term remorse should be reserved for the reaction after an act of aggression has actually been carried out. We may remark, incidentally, that the term remorse should be reserved for the reaction after an act of aggression has actually been carried out. After this, owing to the omniscience of the superego, the difference between an aggression intended and an aggression carried out lost its force. Henceforward, A sense of guilt could be produced not only by an act of violence that is actually carried out, as all the world knows, but also by one that is merely intended, as psychoanalysis has discovered. Irrespectively of this alteration in the psychological situation, the conflict arising from ambivalence, the conflict between the two primal instincts, leaves the same result behind. We are tempted to look here for the solution of the problem of the varying relation in which the sense of guilt stands to consciousness. It might be thought that a sense of guilt arising from remorse for an evil deed must always be conscious, whereas a sense of guilt arising from the perception of an evil impulse may remain unconscious. But the answer is not so simple as that. Obsessional neurosis speaks energetically against it. The second contradiction concerned the aggressive energy with which we suppose the superego to be endowed. According to one view, that energy merely carries on the punitive energy of the external authority and keeps it alive in the mind, while, according to another view, it consists, on the contrary, of one's own aggressive energy which has not been used and which one now directs against that inhibiting authority. The first view seemed to fit in better with the history, and the second with the theory of the sense of guilt. Closer reflection has resolved this apparently irreconcilable contradiction almost too completely. What remained as the essential and common factor was that in each case we were dealing with an aggressiveness which had been displaced inwards. Clinical observation, moreover, allows us in fact to distinguish two sources for the aggressiveness which we attribute to the superego. One or the other of them exercises the stronger effect in any given case, but as a general rule they operate in unison. This is, I think, the place at which to put forward for serious consideration a view which I have earlier recommended for provisional acceptance. In the most recent analytic literature, a predilection is shown for the idea that any kind of frustration, any thwarted instinctual satisfaction, results, or may result, in a heightening of the sense of guilt. A great theoretical simplification will, I think, be achieved if we regard this as applying only to the aggressive instincts, and little will be found to contradict this assumption. For how are we to account, on dynamic and economic grounds, for an increase in the sense of guilt appearing in place of an unfulfilled erotic demand? This only seems possible in a roundabout way, if we suppose, that is, that the prevention of an erotic satisfaction calls up a piece of aggressiveness against the person who has interfered with the satisfaction, and that this aggressiveness has itself to be suppressed in turn. But if this is so, it is after all only the aggressiveness which is transformed into a sense of guilt by being suppressed and made over to the superego. I am convinced that many processes will admit of a simpler and clearer exposition if the findings of psychoanalysis with regard to the derivation of the sense of guilt are restricted to the aggressive instincts. Examination of the clinical material gives us no unequivocal answer here, because, as our hypothesis tells us, the two classes of instinct hardly ever appear in a pure form, isolated from each other. But an investigation of extreme cases would probably point in the direction I anticipate. I am tempted to extract a first advantage from this more restricted view of the case by applying it to the process of repression. As we have learned, neurotic symptoms are, in their essence, substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes. In the course of our analytic work, we have discovered to our surprise that perhaps every neurosis conceals a quota of unconscious sense of guilt, which, in its turn, fortifies the symptoms by making use of them as a punishment. It now seems plausible to formulate the following proposition. When an instinctual trend undergoes repression, its libidinal elements are turned into symptoms, and its aggressive components into a sense of guilt. Even if this proposition is only an average approximation to the truth, it is worthy of our interest. Some readers of this work may further have an impression that they have heard the formula of the struggle between Eros and the death instinct too often. It was alleged to characterize the process of civilization which mankind undergoes, but it was also brought into connection with the development of the individual, and, in addition, it was said to have revealed the secret of organic life in general. We cannot, I think, avoid going into the relations of these three processes to one another. The repetition of the same formula is justified by the consideration that both the process of human civilization and of the development of the individual are also vital processes, which is to say that they must share in the most general characteristic of life. On the other hand, evidence of the presence of this general characteristic fails, for the very reason of its general nature, to help us to arrive at any differentiation between the processes, so long as it is not narrowed down by special qualifications. We can only be satisfied, therefore, if we assert that the process of civilization is a modification which the vital process experiences under the influence of a task that is set it by Eros and instigated by Ananke, by the exigencies of reality, and that this task is one of uniting separate individuals into a community bound together by libidinal ties. When, however, we look at the relation between the process of human civilization and the developmental or educative process of individual human beings, we shall conclude without much hesitation that the two are very similar in nature, if not the very same process applied to different kinds of object. The process of the civilization of the human species is, of course, an abstraction of a higher order than is the development of the individual, and it is therefore harder to apprehend in concrete terms, nor should we pursue analogies to an obsessional extreme. But in view of the similarity between the aims of the two processes, in the one case the integration of a separate individual into a human group, and in the other case the creation of a unified group out of many individuals, we cannot be surprised at the similarity between the means employed and the resultant phenomena. In view of its exceptional importance, we must not long postpone the mention of one feature which distinguishes between the two processes. In the developmental process of the individual, the program of the pleasure principle, which consists in finding the satisfaction of happiness, is retained as the main aim. Integration in, or adaptation to, a human community appears as a scarcely avoidable condition which must be fulfilled before this aim of happiness can be achieved. If it could be done without that condition, it would perhaps be preferable. To put it in other words, the development of the individual seems to us to be a product of the interaction between two urges, the urge towards happiness, which we usually call egoistic, and the urge towards union with others in the community, which we call altruistic. Neither of these descriptions goes much below the surface. In the process of individual development, as we have said, the main accent falls mostly on the egoistic urge, or the urge towards happiness, while the other urge, which may be described as a cultural one, is usually content with the role of imposing restrictions. But in the process of civilization, things are different. Here, by far, the most important thing is the aim of creating a unity out of the individual human beings. It is true that the aim of happiness is still there, but it is pushed into the background. It almost seems as if the creation of a great human community would be most successful if no attention had to be paid to the happiness of the individual. The developmental process of the individual can thus be expected to have special features of its own, which are not reproduced in the process of human civilization. It is only insofar as the first of these processes has union with the community as its aim that it need coincide with the second process. Just as a planet revolves around a central body as well as rotating on its own axis, so the human individual takes part in the course of development of mankind at the same time as he pursues his own path in life. But to our dull eyes, the play of forces in the heavens seems fixed in a never-changing order. In the field of organic life, we can still see how the forces contend with one another, and how the effects of the conflict are continually changing. So also the two urges, the one towards personal happiness, and the other towards union with other human beings, must struggle with each other in every individual. And so also the two processes of individual and of cultural development must stand in hostile opposition to each other, and mutually dispute the ground. But this struggle between the individual and society is not a derivative of the contradiction, probably an irreconcilable one, between the primal instincts of eros and death. It is a dispute within the economics of the libido, comparable to the contest concerning the distribution of libido between ego and objects. And it does admit of an eventual accommodation in the individual, as it may be hoped, it will also do in the future of civilization, however much that civilization may oppress the life of the individual today. The analogy between the process of civilization and the path of individual development may be extended in an important respect. It can be asserted that the community too evolves a superego under whose influence cultural development proceeds. It would be a tempting task for anyone who has a knowledge of human civilizations to follow out this analogy in detail. I will confine myself to bringing forward a few striking points. The superego of an epoch of civilization has an origin similar to that of an individual. It is based on the impression left behind by the personalities of great leaders, men of overwhelming force of mind, or men in whom one of the human impulsions has found its strongest and purest, and therefore often its most one-sided, expression. In many instances the analogy goes still further, in that during their lifetime these figures were, often enough, even if not always, mocked and maltreated by others, and even dispatched in a cruel fashion. In the same way, indeed, the primal father did not attain divinity until long after he had met his death by violence. The most arresting example of this fateful conjunction is to be seen in the figure of Jesus Christ, if indeed that figure is not a part of mythology, which called it into being from an obscure memory of that primal event. Another point of agreement between the cultural and the individual superego is that the former, just like the latter, sets up strict ideal demands, disobedience to which is visited with fear of conscience. Here indeed we come across the remarkable circumstance that the mental processes concerned are actually more familiar to us and more accessible to consciousness as they are seen in the group than they can be in the individual man. In him, when tension arises, it is only the aggressiveness of the superego which, in the form of reproaches, makes itself noisily heard. Its actual demands often remain unconscious in the background. If we bring them to conscious knowledge, we find that they coincide with the precepts of the prevailing cultural superego. At this point, the two processes, that of the cultural development of the group and that of the cultural development of the individual, are, as it were, always interlocked. For that reason, some of the manifestations and properties of the superego can be more easily detected in its behavior in the cultural community than in the separate individual. The cultural superego has developed its ideals and set up its demands. Among the latter, those which deal with the relations of human beings to one another are comprised under the heading of ethics. People have at all times set the greatest value on ethics, as though they expected that it in particular would produce especially important results. And it does, in fact, deal with a subject which can easily be recognized as the sorest spot in every civilization. Ethics is thus to be regarded as a therapeutic attempt, as an endeavor to achieve, by means of a command of the superego, something which has so far not been achieved by means of any other cultural activities. As we already know, the problem before us is how to get rid of the greatest hindrance to civilization, namely the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. And for that very reason, we are especially interested in what is probably the most recent of the cultural commands of the superego, the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. In our research into and therapy of a neurosis, we are led to make two reproaches against the superego of the individual. In the severity of its commands and prohibitions, it troubles itself too little about the happiness of the ego, in that it takes insufficient account of the resistances against obeying them, of the instinctual strength of the id in the first place, and of the difficulties presented by the real external environment in the second. Consequently, we are very often obliged, for therapeutic purposes, to oppose the superego, and we endeavor to lower its demands. Exactly the same objections can be made against the ethical demands of the cultural superego. It, too, does not trouble itself enough about the facts of the mental constitution of human beings. It issues a command, and does not ask whether it is possible for people to obey it. On the contrary, it assumes that a man's ego is psychologically capable of anything that is required of it, that his ego has unlimited mastery over his id. This is a mistake, and even in what are known as normal people, the id cannot be controlled beyond certain limits. If more is demanded of a man, a revolt will be produced in him or a neurosis, or he will be made unhappy. The commandment, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," is the strongest defense against human aggressiveness, and an excellent example of the unpsychological proceedings of the cultural superego. The commandment is impossible to fulfill. Such an enormous inflation of love can only lower its value, not get rid of the difficulty. Civilization pays no attention to all this. It merely admonishes us that the harder it is to obey the precept, the more meritorious it is to do so. But anyone who follows such a precept in present-day civilization only puts himself at a disadvantage vis-à-vis the person who disregards it. What a potent obstacle to civilization aggressiveness must be, if the defense against it can cause as much unhappiness as aggressiveness itself. Natural ethics, as it is called, has nothing to offer here except the narcissistic satisfaction of being able to think oneself better than others. At this point, the ethics based on religion introduces its promises of a better afterlife. But so long as virtue is not rewarded here on earth, ethics will, I fancy, preach in vain. I too think it quite certain that a real change in the relations of human beings to possessions would be of more help in this direction than any ethical commands. But the recognition of this fact among socialists has been obscured and made useless for practical purposes by a fresh idealistic misconception of human nature. I believe the line of thought which seeks to trace in the phenomena of cultural development the part played by a superego promises still further discoveries. I hasten to come to a close, but there is one question which I can hardly evade. If the development of civilization has such a far-reaching similarity to the development of the individual, and if it employs the same methods, may we not be justified in reaching the diagnosis that, under the influence of cultural urges, some civilizations, or some epochs of civilization, possibly the whole of mankind, have become neurotic? An analytic dissection of such neuroses might lead to therapeutic recommendations which could lay claim to great practical interest. I would not say that an attempt of this kind to carry psychoanalysis over to the cultural community was absurd or doomed to be fruitless. But we should have to be very cautious and not forget that, after all, we are only dealing with analogies, and that it is dangerous, not only with men but also with concepts, to tear them from the sphere in which they have originated and been evolved. Moreover, the diagnosis of communal neuroses is faced with a special difficulty. In an individual neurosis, we take as our starting point the contrast that distinguishes the patient from his environment, which is assumed to be normal. For a group all of whose members are affected by one and the same disorder, no such background could exist. It would have to be found elsewhere. And as regards the therapeutic application of our knowledge, what would be the use of the most correct analysis of social neuroses, since no one possesses authority to impose such a therapy upon the group? But in spite of all these difficulties, we may expect that one day someone will venture to embark upon a pathology of cultural communities. For a wide variety of reasons, it is very far from my intention to express an opinion upon the value of human civilization. I have endeavored to guard myself against the enthusiastic prejudice which holds that our civilization is the most precious thing that we possess or could acquire, and that its path will necessarily lead to heights of unimagined perfection. I can at least listen without indignation to the critic who is of the opinion that when one surveys the aims of cultural endeavor and the means it employs, one is bound to come to the conclusion that the whole effort is not worth the trouble, and that the outcome of it can only be a state of affairs which the individual will be unable to tolerate. My impartiality is made all the easier to me by my knowing very little about all these things. One thing only do I know for certain, and that is that man's judgments of value follow directly his wishes for happiness, that, accordingly, they are an attempt to support his illusions with arguments. I should find it very understandable if someone were to point out the obligatory nature of the course of human civilization, and were to say, for instance, that the tendencies to a restriction of sexual life or to the institution of a humanitarian ideal at the expense of natural selection were developmental trends which cannot be averted or turned aside, and to which it is best for us to yield as though they were necessities of nature. I know, too, the objection that can be made against this, to the effect that in the history of mankind trends such as these, which were considered unsurmountable, have often been thrown aside and replaced by other trends. Thus I have not the courage to rise up before my fellow men as a prophet, and I bow to their reproach that I can offer them no consolation. For at bottom that is what they are all demanding, the wildest revolutionaries no less passionately than the most virtuous believers. The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. It may be that in this respect precisely the present time deserves a special interest. Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help they would have no difficulty in exterminating one another to the last man. They know this, and hence comes a large part of their current unrest, their unhappiness, and their mood of anxiety. And now it is to be expected that the other of the two heavenly powers, eternal Eros, will make an effort to assert himself in the struggle with his equally immortal adversary. But who can foresee with what success and with what result? This concludes the reading of Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. This book was read by Michael Prichard.